Hello, everyone. My name is Diani Feiga. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the co-chair of the Core Preservation Outreach Committee. My day job is the Director of Preservation Services at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. As you probably know, Preservation Week was last week, and it focused on the theme of preservation in the face of climate change. It was a fantastic success, and we are delighted to be here holding this wrap-up event, Q&A forum with Preservation Week's Honorary Chair, Elizabeth Yeampierre. So welcome, everyone, and my colleague Brooke from CORE has dropped the code of conduct in the chat. So I am going to introduce Elizabeth, turn things over to her for a bit, and then open everything up to questions. So Elizabeth Yeampierre is the Executive Director of the Brooklyn-based Latinx community organization UPROSE. She is an internationally recognized Puerto Rican attorney and environmental and climate justice leader of African and Indigenous ancestry. She is a fierce advocate and trailblazer for community organizing around just, sustainable development, environmental justice, and community-led climate adaptation. So I will turn things over to Elizabeth. I have a few questions that the committee has prepared, but I would definitely encourage all of you, as you have them, to drop your questions in the chat because this is meant to be an open forum. So thank you so much for being here, Elizabeth.
Well, thank you so much, Danny. And I am so honored to be the chair of Preservation Week. And so it's been such a delightful experience working with your team. They are literally the embodiment of collective care. It has been, you've just made a schedule which is really sort of crazy, really easy for me to be able to participate in this way. Also really happy that that you were centering a conversation about climate change because, you know, we're living in dire times where there is so much that is uncertain, and we're coming out of a time period where people are really feeling the impact of economic instability, of the kinds of ways that COVID has shown up in our communities, and everything sort of feels like up in the air. And then on top of all of that, we're also dealing with the threat of climate change. And that feels really big, unwieldy, and something that we can't wrap our heads around or even put up solutions for. And so it is a scary but necessary conversation. And it makes sense that it would happen during Preservation Week, where we are really talking about institutions that really anchor learning and community all across the country. If it wasn't for libraries, I wouldn't literally be here right now. It's the place that my mom dropped me and where I was able to really sort of embrace imagination and learning in all kinds of sectors and fields that were not always open to children like me who came from, you know, from poverty, who didn't have those opportunities available. It was where I got my education and access to books and was in community. And so it is a place that holds memories, it holds our resistance, it holds what's possible. And so this has been a journey that was just wonderful for me. And I'm happy to share about UPROSE and the work that I've been doing. So, you know, I was born and raised in New York City, and I come from a working class family. I'm the first in my family to go to college and law school. And UPROSE is the oldest Latino organization in Brooklyn, and we are an intergenerational, leaderful, a matriarchal organization that works at the intersection of racial justice and climate change. And often when people think about climate change, they think about the reduction of carbon to address climate change, and they never think about environmental justice or the reduction of emissions like, you know, NOx and SOx, the things that get trapped in our lungs and create asthma, upper respiratory disease, the things that actually contributed to disparate levels of COVID in poor Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, right? And so that is the area that I went into without ever having taken a class, without ever having studied. I was a civil rights litigator, and I came to UPROSE, and people were complaining about not being able to breathe. They were complaining complaining about the siting of polluting infrastructure and could I help? And so listening and honoring people in the front line and being able to use whatever skills I had to be resourceful to support and staff community needs, community priorities, and a community vision, I went into the area of environmental justice because that's what people were saying they needed. That they couldn't fight for housing or employment or social services or extreme policing if they couldn't breathe, that there was nothing more fundamental than that. And at the time, it was the mid-90s, it was 1996. They were planning the expansion of the Gowanus Expressway in Brooklyn, which has 200,000 cars going through there every day and 25,000 trucks. People were also saying that they lived in a lead belt and that they needed lead paint abatement. And so, so we started learning together, and the organization became intergenerational because young people started coming in, and we thought of young people as being part of a continuum of leadership in our community, not a program, not people that we are like, oh, the young people are so smart, but integral to leadership. And so the culture of practice in the organization changed, and it was changed based on what we felt was necessary so that we can envision the future that we wanted to live in. And that future was one that would take us away from an extractive economy to a renewable one, but it was also a future that would embrace what just relationships look like, how we would be able to bring in our full selves and build across race and ethnicity and gender so that we could be creating the kind of society that we thought we deserved, that we had long deserved. And so that became kind of the cultural practice of UPROSE. And to this day, we have so many accomplishments, everything from doubling the amount of open space in the community to stopping the siting of power plants that would have been the size of 3 football fields, to holding climate justice youth summits, which would have been the largest in the country, to also passing the most aggressive climate legislation as part of New York Renews, which is a statewide coalition in the country, right? And just recently learning that we're going to be able to decommission 3 peaker plants, which for people who don't know, are probably the most polluting infrastructure that exists in our community, that drops tons of contaminants into people's lungs and into their bloodstream. And so there's a lot that we've been able to do. And just even in terms of preservation, you know, one of the things that I learned through doing this is, where do we keep those memories of those learnings, right? The learnings that we have been able to develop as a result of trying different campaigns and different initiatives and trying to get communities engaged in a meaningful way. And I mean meaningful in the sense that we're not in our offices trying to figure out what's in the best interest of communities, but we're trying to make sure that they are leading and that we are staffing while they are taking care of their children and holding on to 2 or 3 jobs. And so, you know, we were part of the leadership of the People's Climate March in 2014. And I don't know if any of you have Googled that, but that was more than 400,000 people. And it was surrounded with art builds. We were able to work with the art community to lift the local narrative. And a lot of that art lives in our organization. When you see sunflowers, you think climate justice, you think UPROSE. We became sort of the house of the sunflowers. And because of that, this is what the sunflower represented. In our organizations all over the country, I'm co-chair of the Climate Justice Alliance. All of that art, the parachutes, the banner drops, we wanted to create sort of a spectacle for the world to see of how communities in our community, how communities care deeply about the future, about moving away from an extractive economy and fighting the bad, building the new, and literally changing the rules, right? This is what we're trying to do in the climate justice movement, and we are doing it. And we're doing it by, in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, where we're located, we launched the first community-owned solar cooperative. We are now working closely with the state to operationalize offshore wind and bring 1,200 jobs into the community, working on things that are very technical sometimes, but at the center of that is always racial justice and equity and a just transition, because we can't repeat or create a model of what got us here in the first place. And that really means decolonizing and rethinking who we are, who we've been with each other, and how we create different economies of scale that are going to create and strengthen social cohesion in our community so that they can withstand the impact of climate change. And you've seen it. You've seen it through Hurricane Maria, Hurricane Andrew, Hurricane Ida, Superstorm Sandy, the fires on the West Coast. You're seeing it all over the United States. Katrina, which people seem to forget about, and I can't get it off my mind. Literally, people have died and are dying as a result of extreme weather events. We're also seeing tornadoes in Brooklyn. That is so unusual. And the minute you've got your third one, it becomes normalized, and there's nothing normal about it. You're seeing the pollen count becoming so much higher, and you're seeing animals and birds literally dropping out of the sky and literally disappearing. So I don't know who's not paying attention to this, but the science is telling us, and if we don't pay attention to the science, certainly Mother Earth is delivering a message on a regular basis. And there's so much that so many of us can do to start really strengthening social cohesion and using libraries and using the institutions in our communities to work to start moving away from an economy that has put us in harm's way. And you can't always blame people. You know, people create these economies based on what they know at the time. But what we know right now is that the economy that we have been brought into is no longer working for us and is no longer working for the planet. We also know we can make connections between climate change and the history of enslavement, the history of colonialism, which is the history of extraction. Right? And so it's a long history of communities that are going to be the most impacted, the ones who are not responsible for climate change, having to lead with solutions that honor Mother Earth and really sort of embracing our historical knowledge and traditions as a way of developing systems that make it possible for us to be able to thrive in the midst of what we expect to be disruption. So it's exciting that libraries are having this conversation because it isn't just an intersectional issue, it's a multidimensional issue. It affects organizing, policy, popular education, and it's multisectoral. Literally, like, it doesn't matter what you're doing, whether you're an accountant, you know, whether you're an educator, whether you are, you know, someone who is responsible for maintaining space, you are going to be impacted by climate change. And so this is your issue. This is the human rights issue of our time. And so it's one of the reasons why, and also just on a personal level, just the fact of how I grew up and the role that libraries played in my personal, my individual empowerment and what that meant for my family. And how so many of us have found that those are the spaces where we can just literally access a world of information so different from the internet, where so much of the information being fed to us is curated. In the library, you can curate it yourself. You can literally travel and navigate your way through everything of our history and learning from history, from our mistakes, from our serious mistakes, and also from our wins, where we've had victories, where we've been able to come together as communities to transform our landscape and transform legislation and transform our relationships to what's possible. Literally a world of imagination of what's possible. So, so it seems right that this conversation would be had during Preservation Week, because if this was not happening, it would feel like libraries were dated and conventional and were really sort of in the past, thinking that everything is the same. Nothing is the same. Everything has changed. Literally, from our constitutional rights that are being eviscerated every single day, to how we are relating to each other has changed. The weather is changing. Our economic system is destabilized. And the only thing that we know to be true is that in a moment of despair and when we are challenged, that we literally use these relationships that we have had historically to anchor each other and to engage in deep collective care. And so libraries are those places, those are those anchors, right? Where you go in and you could sit quietly somewhere and be exposed to different ways of thinking and figure out what makes sense in this historical moment. So I'm really honored and really grateful to be in this conversation, and happy to listen and engage in any questions that you have. You know, I'm in Brooklyn, in Lenape land, and on Sunset Park. I'm home right now. I'm hoping my dogs won't go crazy, because they do every once in a while, and I am home. But literally happy to engage, because remember, it only takes a few people to change everything. And so that could be the people that are in this room right now. So gracias.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for telling us a little more about yourself and what you do, and kind of what brought you to be here with us this afternoon. We already have a question in the chat, so I will go ahead and just go with that question. So Katie asks, how have you connected what you learned about preservation, either, you know, since your invitation to be honorary chair, or just kind of anytime, how have you connected preservation to your own work, or even personally?
So thank you for that question. Personally, my grandmother came to this country after having lost 7 children to disease and to toxic exposure in Puerto Rico, in a place that was turned into a manufacturing area. And her story is a story about environmental justice. And she came to live in this country, and she used to take care of me, and I used to spend a lot of time with her. I was a very quiet child who didn't speak till I was 19. I know that's shocking to a lot of people, but I didn't speak. I took in a lot. And I learned a lot from my grandmother, and that story stayed with me. And I hold on to that story, and I share it, because that's a story about listening to the people most impacted, understanding that the fact that my grandmother could not read and write did not mean that she wasn't brilliant. And she certainly shaped my politics as I developed. And so that story and the stories of my family have really shaped who I became. I realized that there was a civil rights movement that made it possible for me to have access to an education, that it was affirmative action that opened the door so that someone like me who came from struggle would be able to use that education. And I sort of feel that by using it to move the dial for people who come from the same background, that I am preserving that history, and I am amplifying it, and I am engaged in that legacy of transformation. And I hope that I'm doing it honor, because I know that if it had not been for Black people, for example, in this country, in the United States, that I would not be in the position that I am right now. This is indigenous land built by Black people and sustained by immigrants. And so that is something we preserve. That is the strength of this country. In terms of the work, how we engage in preservation, there are a lot of things that we're doing that we've never done before. Deciding that we were going to launch the first community-owned solar cooperative in the state of New York required a lot of learning. Engaging in offshore wind requires a lot of learning. We haven't studied engineering. I've never taken an environmental policy class. There's a lot of things. We ask a lot of questions, and we surround ourselves with a lot of knowledgeable people, and we lead with vision that comes from the front line. And so if we want to be able to duplicate the work, and we want to have other communities to benefit from our experience, both our wins and also our mistakes, we need to be able to preserve it. And we need to be able to hold it so that we can share it with other folks. That's really important. So because we don't have, this is a time where we can't be in competition with each other, where we have to collaborate with each other. And we need to really start thinking differently, because capitalism basically has us competing, right? Who's the smartest? Who's the speaker? We believe that we are leaderful, that there isn't any one leader like there was in the 70s and the 80s, that we are leaderful and matriarchal. And what that means is sharing information with each other, and also sharing the mistakes that we've made so that we can all be better and we can hit the ground running. So preservation is at the heart of that. And in libraries, you get access to information about things that have happened historically that we can learn from. So you've got a group of people who decide that they're going to pass, let's say, civil rights legislation, and it's slowed down, right? And it's slowed down because they were trying to accommodate the frailty of privilege, right? And every time you slow down in moving a policy that will benefit the most vulnerable in this country, people literally die. It kills people so that some people can be comfortable. And so we need to be able to move away from that. We can't compromise justice anymore, because when we do it, we're compromising literally the lives of people who will never be named as having lost their lives as a result of trying to make comfortable people comfortable. And climate change is going to disrupt all the comforts that we know. And so we use those things as lessons to figure out, who do we have to be with each other? Because we're going to be in a messy place that's going to challenge everything that we've learned about community and about solutions. So, so maybe I am not defining preservation in the way that it's, but that's what it looks like to me. What it looks like to me is holding on to those memories and those lessons, those learnings, and trying to pivot for this moment that we're in right now. And without that as our grounding, then where do we go? Preservation is our grounding. And so, seems to me very important in the work that we're doing on climate justice, and even the communities we work with. Remember, we're working with people in the Gulf South. We're working with indigenous nations who have long history of memory and preservation of traditions that come from our ancestry as people of African and indigenous ancestry, and traditions and memory that is about how you live in a way that honors Mother Earth and honors community. And that's transformation right there. So yeah, I think it's central. Yeah, I hope I answered your question.
Oh, that was fantastic. And the definition of what could be considered preservation is so broad, and I find that kind of inspiring and empowering. So I think 100% the things that you were mentioning absolutely fit in with a broad definition of preservation. And I think that, one of the goals of Preservation Week is to try to teach not only folks working in collecting institutions, but the public at large, just how much preservation is pervasive throughout every aspect of our lives. So we got another question. We got it in the Q&A box, and this is a really powerful one. A sense of shared time and space is so necessary to preserve the collective memory of a group of people. How do you preserve a sense of community when members get displaced because of climate change and gentrification?
Well, thank you so much for that question, because that was the question that was posed to us about 7 years ago in Sunset Park. Sunset Park is an industrial working waterfront community. And for years, the industrial sector was responsible for literally killing the community, but the community needed to work in the industrial sector in order to keep its working class character. And so we had to make a decision about, how do you preserve the working class character of the community and address climate change in a sector that is extractive. And so at that time, there was a developer called Industry City that submitted a proposal to rezone the industrial sector and turn it into a destination location for the privilege that would bring high tech and offices to that space. What that would mean would be a loss of jobs, displacement for the residents and for small businesses. And so we needed to come up with a solution for that, because all across the country, people were fighting against these industrial zones that were, literally making them exposed to PM 2.5, NOx, SOx, all of the bad things that make us sick, right? So as part of a 10-year process of deep community-based planning, we created a vision called the Grid, which is about the green reindustrialization of the sector. And so we were asked to fight this displacement effort. The company was a company that was well resourced, had 5 public relations firms, worked with all the power brokers in New York City, everything from the Partnership of New York to Rebney. And everyone told us this was a losing battle, that this was not going to be won, that it was like a fight of David against 3 Goliaths. And I really believed that we could win, that we needed to be creative, and that we needed to look at what the community was saying was they wanted, and how we could preserve the working class character of the community. And so we led with the grid, which was basically, how do you, instead of following the market, create the market? And how do you make sure that the jobs that we're bringing are building for climate adaptation, mitigation, and resilience? And how do we also make sure that we're talking about things like food sovereignty, which is going to be disrupted? And how do we connect our industrial waterfront to economically depressed upstate farmers who don't have a relationship with us and are divided by race, right? But not by class. And how do we make sure that we map the entire area for different kinds of scales of renewable energy and create sort of a carbon neutral supply chain that incentivizes small businesses? It's a really complex and beautiful thing, and you should go to our website to check it out. And so for 7 years we fought. And for 7 years, I was terrified that we were going to lose. And, you know, we're coming up on Mother's Day, and I lost my mother about 7 months ago. And I remember calling her almost every day saying, Mom, we can't lose, because if we lose, we will never be able to build for our climate future. But what's worse is that the community will be spread out. And we know that social cohesion is central to survival. When there are extreme heat events, when there are extreme weather events, that the people will survive if they are in community with each other and they have a history of being in community with each other. Regardless of their income, we know they will survive. But if this developer wins, literally people will die. And we will never be able to again have access to the largest significant maritime industrial area in New York City to build for that future. And so I would call daily, and she would say, don't worry, you got this, and all the things that mothers say to daughters. And I would get myself up again, but it was a big fight, including fighting against unions who were being told that we were threatening their jobs when we were basically talking about green jobs that paid more, that brought more benefits, right? And jobs at a time when COVID hit us, when you knew that nobody was coming to the office, and office space that could have been easily done in Manhattan and not an industrial area. So it was a complex response centering community needs, respecting community demands, and community-based planning that got us to win literally last fall. And so with this plan now, we've been able to attract $500 million in investments for offshore wind. And that staging and that assemblage is happening at the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal. And we have gotten support from NYSERDA, which is the state agency equivalent to the Department of Energy at the federal level. And we were able to use legislation that we helped pass to bring investments for infrastructure in our community so that we can have a vine. We never say pipeline, we always say vine, a vine of opportunities for our community, keep the working class character of our community, prevent displacement, and build for the future. And so the response and the answer is different depending on where you are, right? It can't be cookie cutter. Remember that the topography is different in different communities. The history of communities is different. The demographics is different. And so what the solution for what we call a just transition looks like in West Virginia or in Kentucky is not the same as it's going to be in the Gulf South. It's not going to be the same as it is in a densely populated area like Sunset Park, Brooklyn. And so that's why it's important that people not become missionaries and helicopter in with solutions, but that that people are able to use their resources to support and amplify community-led visions, because they're the only ones that are going to be able to help us. And they're not, and they're so different from each other. But at the end of the day, they're really complex, and it's what is really needed. So that's what we did in Sunset Park. And it's a major victory. People were stunned. They couldn't believe that this thing happened. And we did it by honoring what our community was saying, including small businesses, which people forget are the backbone of any community. We also have an initiative with auto salvaging shops. After Superstorm Sandy, we were concerned that auto salvaging shops, these are mom and pop shops where people don't have a formal education or working with chemicals and are engaged in toxic exposure without anyone ever having provided them with information about how to containerize the chemicals, how to create best practices so that these small businesses can thrive in the midst of extreme weather events. And so we're going to be launching an app that we've created to educate those businesses. There are about 90 of them in Sunset Park. And so environmentalists traditionally would tell you to shut them down because they pollute and because they drop their chemicals everywhere. But an environmental justice activist is not going to say that. We're not going to say shut them down to working class people who know how to fix things. We're going to try to come in and ask them, how would you like to learn more about how to protect yourself, your workers, and your family that manages this shop, and how to protect yourself from these chemicals and how you can thrive economically in the face of climate change. We're going to have a different conversation because we come from the working class. And so we don't have the luxury of shutting people down. And the industrial waterfront was another area where we could say shut it down when our people work there and have had to choose for generations between putting food on the table and toxic exposure. We needed to figure out a way to transition it so that we'd be able to work, have an income, but that it shouldn't have to kill our community. And so we did the same thing with our small businesses because at the end of the day, we don't come from privilege, and our people have to put food on the table. And so all of that has been tremendously successful, but also it's a way of making sure that the working class community can work and live and thrive in its community without being displaced by climate solutions. Climate solutions should not become environmental justice problems.
Thank you very much. And I love the phrase vine of opportunity. I jotted that down, and I definitely want to incorporate that into my vocabulary. So thank you. So definitely keep questions coming. If you have any from the audience, either drop them in the chat or in the Q&A box. I will just ask another one that the committee had. And this is changing gears a little bit, but I think it's good to talk about as well. So one topic that Preservation Week encourages individuals to explore is preserving family memories. Were there preserved memories or treasured objects that you experienced within your family or your community that have a strong place in your heart? I know you talked about your experience, going to libraries, but as we know, not all collections are within libraries. So I was just interested to hear from you on your family or community collecting side.
Yeah, I grew up in the 70s in New York and 80s. I hit my 20s in the 80s, and my mom felt like New York was sort of this intellectual playground. And she would take us to street fairs and cultural events, and she would take us to museums. And back in the day, you could go without having to pay. There wasn't an admission fee, and you could take a family with 4 children to all these events. And it felt like every neighborhood was a repository of culture and information. And so, in the Lower East Side, we were, that's where we had, Kasha Kanish's and we had, chocolate babka, and then we'd go to Chinatown, and my mom would stop at the temple. And it felt like every community was really preserving its cultural heritage and its history in New York City, and that made it a cool place to grow up, right? And then there were so many museums. We went to museums almost every weekend. And then cultural institutions that had dance And I learned, like my mom took me to the Caribbean Cultural Center when I was really young and learned a lot about the African diaspora there and how, and I learned about Arturo Schomburg, that Arturo Schomburg was born in Puerto Rico and had the largest collection on the mid-Atlantic slave trade, and that he was Puerto Rican and no one knows that. And that of all of the enslaved that ended up in the Americas, literally about 5% ended up in the United States, but most of them ended up in the Caribbean and Central America and in the Americas. And it made me feel like I was part of the bigger world, right? Because I knew my ancestry. So I don't know if that's the question, but in your neighborhood, there are so many places that holds that memory, not just in your family. Your family, you have to sort of record, particularly with our elders, you need to record those stories because they really are treasures. And I learned so much. And those were sort of my guideposts, right? As I was growing up at a time where there was deep economic disinvestment in New York City, growing up in the middle of fires everywhere, literally being exposed to the Young Lords, the Black Panthers, all of that as a child, listening to those stories, listening to stories about the civil rights movement when I was little, while living in a place that felt fundamentally unsafe for a child. For those people who were asking about displacement, I went to 5 schools in 8 years. We were displaced several times. And so I think that's one of the reasons why I was so shy, because I went to 5 schools in 8 years. And so I didn't speak. And what that does to you and how unsafe you feel as a child. And growing up at that time, there was just a lot of violence and a lot of poverty. And you saw things as a child that children are not supposed to see. And so the safe places were the places where people were really sort of preserving the history of actions that had made it possible for us to be able to survive despite all of the threats to our existence. And so those were places where we danced, where we created art, and where there was a lot of storytelling. And that to this day is part of the organization that I lead. My organization and our movement, the climate justice movement, really preserves stories. We're really all storytellers, and we all remember because it's intergenerational. And so the stories get passed on from one generation to the other. It's part of our history as people. And so that's not any one place, it's a lot of places. And I would just say for New York City, for those people who are not from there and may have assumptions about New York, I feel like the media promotes really negative images of New York City. But my memories is, a blackout, September 11, COVID, all of the Superstorm Sandy, Superstorm Ida, Hurricane Ida, and how in the midst of what felt really frightening and overwhelming, people came together right on the block parties, barbecues with food so that it wouldn't go bad, sharing, checking in on each other. I remember during COVID, just food showing up on my steps. Like people deeply, like a level of love and care that people who don't talk to each other, who you go by and you don't really, because we're not like from other places where everybody stops and chats on the way, you just don't even talk to each other, but you know who your neighbor is. But in moments where there has been a strike on us, people just really showing up in the ways that matter, out of love. And I like I said, I was born and raised in New York City, and I love it. I've been all over the country. I speak all over the country, and I love a lot of parts of this country. I love every place that I've gone to, but I love living in a city. I love walking out the door and seeing community right there, having access to everything right there. I think it's a great place for young people, for children to raising children. I raised my son here. And I think it's a great place to grow old because it's also a place that has everything at your fingertips. So the bodega has like people in the bodega on the corner share stories about, did you remember this when this happened and that happened? I know my mom was like the mayor of the block. And when she passed, I met a lot of people who I didn't know were friends with her. And they had all these stories that they had shared with her. We are in a community that is Latino and Asian, and they play mahjong, and we play dominoes, right? And to see that sort of like dominoes and mahjong thing going on, that can, I swear that can only happen here. And isn't that part of our memory, right? In our development and how we evolve as human beings. I don't know. I just think it's the coolest thing.
I lived in New York for about 12 years in my early adulthood, and you made me miss it a lot. So again, please drop questions in the chat if you have them. I just wanted to follow up on something that you mentioned in what you were just sharing. I was hoping you could say more about how the climate justice movement preserves stories. You mentioned that really interesting point kind of just quickly, but I was wondering if you could elaborate on how that is happening.
So, you know, the climate justice movement is really led by Black, Indigenous, and people of color from the front line, the people who are going to be most impacted by climate change and least responsible for it. And it's global. I mean, people in Brazil, people in the River Niger, all over the world. The global South is leading the climate justice movement. And here in the United States, we're talking about people in the Gulf South, everything from indigenous indigenous people in the Gulf South to historical Black communities that go back to enslavement, to Vietnamese fisher people who live in the Gulf South. And then if you go west, you're talking about Alaska, and you're talking about Oregon and California, Detroit, the Southwest, where you've got indigenous communities that are living literally downwind from radioactive power plants, from radioactive waste. So there's a long, long history of people in this country fighting for environmental justice and fighting against the discriminatory siting of this infrastructure in our communities, because it literally kills us, right? But also a long history of honoring Mother Earth and looking at how do we repair, how do we invest, and how do we regenerate, right? And really also reclaiming our traditions, and that comes through story. So someone like Tom Goldtooth, who heads the Indigenous Environmental Network, I remember when I was really young, just sort of sitting, taking in all the stories that he was sharing about how Indigenous people in the United States have been warning us about this future that we're in right now, and how their traditions were being literally dismantled. And those were the traditions that we needed in terms of how to maintain the soil and biodiversity, all of the things that are necessary. We hear from the people in Canada about companies like Hydro-Quebec and how it's disruptive to ecosystems and what that's going to do. Using that to provide New York State with energy at low cost can destroy ecosystems that are not just important for Indigenous land, but because of, but entire ecosystems and their complexity. So a lot of the science and a lot of the math, a lot of the engineering, a lot of the things that we're working on right now come from these stories that are shared. People in Mississippi who share in Co-op Jackson, Mississippi, who share stories about, you know, how do you create food cooperatives, and this Black dirt farmers, that's what they're called in Philly, really sort of going back to traditions where Black people can focus on farming and sort of reclaim traditions that they moved away from, because being a farmer at some point became a bad thing, and city life was the positive thing, and working in an office was the positive thing, because people were judged by doing that working class work with the land, right? And so the stories of how our communities were engaged in those things for generations are part of the legacy of those of us who are the modern day warriors who are doing the work in the climate justice movement. And everywhere when we have gatherings, whether they're national or even international, it begins with storytelling. It begins with listening to the elders and hearing about what the lessons were. And we honor that. We honor our elders. So this country, though, pits generations against each other. That's that capitalist thing where you literally pit young people and older people against each other. Older people want to hold on to power. Younger people want to push them out and say, it's my turn. And it's everybody's turn. This is climate change. We are supposed to be in community with each other, learning across the table from each other, building with each other without letting ego or self-promotion or ambition drive one generation away from the other. There is this thing in this country where there is a disrespect for elders and blaming them for everything, and young people coming in with arrogance. And here's the thing, young people have answers and they know things we don't know, and they are necessary and need to be central to the climate justice movement, but so do older people. It has to be done together. It has to be intergenerational. And in the climate justice movement, we are intergenerational. We believe that leadership is a continuum, and you exercise leadership throughout the continuum, and that it comes with responsibility and accountability. You know, in this country too, the focus is on the individual. What do you think? How do you feel? And the climate justice movement is what is in the interest of our community. How do we work to be able to serve the collective interests? How do we make sure we're taking care of the most vulnerable? For us, the questions are different. And we learned that through storytelling about how everyone took care of the whole, of the collective. So the individual gets taken care of by taking care of the collective. And it's a different way of thinking about power. We think about shared power, shared leadership, co-governance. We even talk to our elected officials, the new ones, about the fact that we are a brain trust, that they shouldn't think they know everything about all the things that they need to know, that they should think about community as a brain trust and as a partner in decision making. That's co-governance. So that I have to take that back to storytelling and how I learned, because I didn't learn this in school. I didn't learn this in a classroom. I didn't learn this anywhere other than in community by listening to stories and wanting to honor some principles that I think make sense to me on a spiritual level, but also as someone who believes in transforming the landscape, that we're possible, that we can do that, honoring that. I believe that. The lessons the stories my mom would tell me when I was growing up about my ancestors, I honor that every day. And, you know, we look like a lot of different things, right? Because sometimes we're so mixed that you don't know sometimes by looking at us. But we look like the future. I always say we look like, or like Bruno Mars, we look like the future. I say jokingly, when everybody mixes, right? We'll all look like Bruno Mars. But the truth is that that we are made up of those stories. Even when we check out our ancestry and do that DNA test, that's a scientific manifestation of our stories as people. And so, storytelling is central, the narrative and how we create an arc so that we can bring in new people. Think about what our people are going through right now and how to get them into climate change. If you are struggling and you've got 3 children and you're trying to figure out how to put food on the table, and food is really expensive right now because inflation is out of control, and you're struggling and you've got food insecurity and you're dealing with the possibility of displacement and you are dealing with challenges that you never expected, like being home, trying to school your children or trying to contain all of their energy because you can't take them somewhere. And the mental health issues that you are feeling right now because of a legacy of abuse and how that shows up in literally your body remembers, right? And we're not just talking about all of a sudden you're being exposed to a lot of isms. You come from a legacy of isms. And so in the middle of all of that you have to take care of, like, for example, in this community, it was ICE raids in the middle of COVID, right? In the middle of having to hold your heart and your cells to hold on so much because, you know, that shows up in disease. The IPCC report is telling us that we've got 10 years before we have disruption, climate disruption. People don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear that they can't plan a future for their children 10 years from now. So how do you reach their hearts and minds? And how do you get them to be part of the solution and renew hope? You do that through stories. You do that by reminding them that they are the descendants of people who believed that something else was possible, that their ancestors were slaves, that their ancestors were colonized, that their ancestors were ripped from their homeland, and that despite everything that they've had to endure generation after generation, they are still here, that they are literally a tribute to resistance and to the brilliance of our ancestors, and that they are strong, and that together we are stronger, and that we can work with each other to blunt the impacts of climate change. And you have to be honest. You can't sugarcoat it. My mom used to call it covering the sky with your hand. You can't cover the sky with your hand. You have to be honest, but you also have to lead with solutions and a reminder to people of who they are, of what they've survived. And for the John Browns in our world, right? For all our white allies, for all the people who have opened the door so that we could walk in, who have engaged in anti-racism, who are pro-Black, we have to remind them, you also come from a legacy of transformation. You have been there with us all along. You have always been pro-Black. I'd rather say that than say anti-racist. I want to be like pro-Black. And you have also been, and you have been in the messy conversations that we refuse to be in because they are harmful to us and they trigger us. And we do this stuff together. So yeah, this is, like I said at the opening, is a moment of deep reckoning, but it's not just about climate change. It's about who we want to be as a society, as a people, who we are challenging ourselves to be. And that requires going headed deep into messy conversations with no fragility and saying, look at the mess, right? And look at the possibility. If we lead with love, if we center and anchor ourselves in memory, in preservation, in the history and legacy of our communities all over the country, then we can honor that history and those memories. We can preserve those by being better, by challenging ourselves to lead with solutions that are anchored in deep, deep love. And maybe I'm Pollyannish, Danny, but I really believe that it's possible. I've seen transformation in people that were like horrible. And I've gone in, all militant, challenging, threatening to sue, threatening to protest. And I have opened the opportunity for these messy conversations to untangle the mess that we have inherited. And out of that, I've seen consensus, and I've seen people center themselves in love and transformation and engage in deep transformation. Because there's a lot of reasons to hate and be angry. We are justified in feeling all those things if our existence is being threatened constantly. But where will it get us? And honestly, it just hurts us more. So, yeah, we are faced with an existential threat like no other. And the only way that we will survive is by strengthening social cohesion. And we do that by anchoring and preserving the lessons that we've learned. Climate activists, not climate justice activists, climate activists and environmentalists will tell you that there are tech fixes, that there are things that can be done to fix this problem. But without addressing systemic racism and a history of that, without addressing relationship, we will fail. We will fail. These tech fixes that are sort of funded by the same multinational corporations that got us into the situation that we're in right now are not going to get us out of trouble. We are going to get us out of trouble. And so there is a difference between the climate movement and the climate justice movement, the environmental movement and the environmental justice movement. We are made up of the front line of the crisis. And so we don't come from thinking about this as a corporate fix. This is a people fix, a people to people Even when there's an event like a Hurricane Maria, we talk about a just recovery, a people-to-people recovery, literally like not Red Cross coming in with water bottles. We send water filtration devices, not sending in diesel operated generators we send solar powered generators, because we know that communities like New Orleans and Puerto Rico lead in the world in levels of asthma. We know community. And the first thing we do is we ask people, what do you need and how can we help? We don't come in with the answers, solving things. We, with humility, with deep humility and respect for the brilliance and local knowledge, say, what do you need and how can we support you? And we think that that is what we call a just recovery, as opposed to helicoptering in and feeling good at the expense of people in pain and getting the selfie. We literally ask, what do you need? And so that's the way that we work in the climate justice and the environmental justice movement. Those two are a little different. The climate justice movement is born out of the environmental justice movement. The environmental justice movement is older. They laid the foundation, and then another younger generation comes and we become part of the climate justice movement, which really is built on the environmental justice movement fought against the unfair siting of environmental burdens in our community. The climate justice movement is moving towards planning and manifesting a vision that will take us away from extraction and take us to a renewable system that is built on matriarchal decision-making and centered on racial justice and equity. So there's differences, and people don't know what those differences are. They use the words like the words are meaningless, or they just slap them on, but there are frameworks that were developed across the country from Puerto Rico to Guam with our members everywhere, building language and frameworks that create a vine of leadership that is multidimensional to address a multidimensional problem and crisis.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate, language is important. And I don't think I fully recognize the nuances between those terms. So I really appreciate you helping with that. So amazingly enough, we have only 2 minutes left in the hour that we have together. This time has really flown by. So I think we did get one more really good question in the chat. And I'm not sure if you have just a quick thought to leave us with about, it is also building off of kind of what you were just talking about the stories and lived experiences and all of these aspects that are being preserved on a community basis.
Yeah.
What do you think about formalizing that, institutionalizing that? In a way, it's almost like the question of the establishment, should university archives be going to community archives and saying, we want to work with you to preserve your collections, or are the experiences best preserved within the community? I don't know if we can even begin to crack that in one more minute, but
let me try. So answer Katie. So yeah, for the climate justice movement, it's organic, and it starts with community priorities, communities telling us how to staff them. And then our institutions are not part of the nonprofit industrial complex. We don't sit around trying to create solutions for the community. We honor the requests and we staff them the way that people staff elected officials. And so it starts with community first, through organizing and through the community telling us what those priorities are. The question that Diani is bringing up about academic institutions is complex because academic institutions are capitalist, they're patriarchal, and they extract from community brilliance. They make money off of it, and then they tell our story for us. Those are not the partnerships that we're looking for or that we want. We want a different kind of partnership, because they even get grants from the National Institutes of Health, from all of these big institutions, and then we come in, do the work, they get the funding, and then we get a stipend. We get otherized by these universities, and that is extractive, capitalist, and that is not the way that we're going to be able to work with each other. The truth is that our communities are involved in data collection, research. They're involved in community-based planning, participatory research of all types, and we add value. And we add value that should be learned in the classroom. And different kinds of partnerships. Universities are siloed and they work within their strict disciplines. And so their way of working with each other does not address our problem because ours is cross-sectoral and they don't know how to work with that. So they need to really change the culture of practice within those institutions. We've worked with universities that are trying to do it differently. And so we've had some success with Pratt, with a bunch of students at Yale, with some students at MIT. We literally say to the professors, this is what we need. You have resources, you have access to data, and you have access to skills that we need in order to move the priorities of the community. And this is the way that we want you to do it. We speak to scientists about how to put science in the hands of people. So there is a space for everyone, but everyone cannot do it in the way that they've learned in this sort of conventional top-down extractive process that really puts us at the margins and only affirms and makes it difficult for us to be able to move in a time of crisis. So universities have to really rethink how they do the work and how they partner with communities and what a partnership really means. And they have to stop thinking of us as the passive recipients of their good intentions and writing articles, telling our stories for us, and going on national, sometimes I've been on platforms where people are telling my story and I'm sitting there laughing, say, wait a minute, I did that work. You're telling my story? You don't have the authenticity to tell my story. You can support, you can elevate. They literally take our language from us, our narrative. And that is just as extractive as the fossil fuel industry and doesn't help us. That is about ego. It's about self. It's about a conventional thinking of the space that universities can be playing. And that could be radically different. They are necessary because they have resources and they have smart people. But the way that they operate is patriarchal and it's dated. It's very dated for what this moment that we're in right now demands a different kind of leaderful power structure. We need to share power with each other. So I don't know if that answers your question, Gianni. I try to say it real fast.
No, very much. Thank you. Thank you very much for that very, very honest and candid answer. I think that's important to hear. So, all right, unfortunately, we are at time. So thank you so much for both being the honorary chair with us during last week and previously, but also for your time this afternoon. And thank you so much more generally for the work that you and your colleagues do. It's critically important. To say that is an understatement, and I have learned so much.
Oh, gracias de corazón. I'm so grateful. And grateful to everybody who's in the space. And anyway, just thank you so much.
Wonderful.
And thank you for asking me to do this. Thank you so much. Take care. Have a happy Mother's Day to everybody who's out there.
Yeah,
happy Mothering Day. Happy
yes.
Mothering Day.
Yes. All right. Thank you so much. And thanks to the audience for your great questions. And as I mentioned, this was recorded, so you can watch it again. And yeah, thanks. Have a great weekend. Have a great rest of your Friday, everyone. Take care.
Peace. Take care.